What we have here in the background is part of a chemical plant property. It's owned by currently a company called Lanxess. It seems very bucolic, natural, but I'm afraid there's a darker history here. In the 1940s through the 1970s, the company at the time, under various ownership, had a tendency of burying material that it couldn't dispose of easily. And these became toxic pits, and they contained literally hundreds, if not thousands, of barrels of DDTs and dioxins, furans. And of course, over time, those steel drums, they rusted out, and the pollution got out and contaminated the water supply.
My family and I were new to Elmira. We had moved to the community from Toronto. So I thought I had come to a lovely, sleepy, romantic kind of town where I could safely raise my kids in an environment that I didn't have to give second thought to. But I was quickly proven wrong.
The announcement was made on the radio.
Yeah.
Some colleague of Daryl's heard it and told him that, you shouldn't drink the water in Elmira and that the main well was shut down. It's Friday afternoon, you can't get hold of anybody in government. And even if you had, they didn't know what was going on either, really. We took our kids and a couple of the neighbors' kids who were playing with our kids and held up a sign on 2 hockey sticks at the main intersection where commuters would be coming back home to say water contamination in Elmira, so people would know that there was something up.
From the get-go, it was like trying to find sort of reliable information and accurate information about what was the matter with the water. We just knew it was shut off.
For days, people did boil their water because they thought it was, probably bacteria. And that was actually the worst thing you could do because that would volatilize the chemicals and then you would breathe it.
We had tremendous concerns about having a shower because of what you would inhale and what would come through your skin. The kids didn't know which water to brush their teeth with, which water they were supposed to feed the dog. Toxic chemicals, typically you can't see them, smell them, or taste them, especially if they're diluted in water. And so there was everything we had taken for granted suddenly was questionable. Initially, water was trucked in from the neighboring community of Kitchener and Waterloo. And you weren't sure that the water that was being trucked in was just as good, but you had no reason to doubt it, yet you had no reason to feel confident with it. So it was like playing Russian roulette, and it was a tremendous amount of stress over the course of a year.
It's a large issue that's been ongoing. When I say from 1989, that's when the wells went down. It's actually started shortly after the company came to town, about 1941.
In the time that I've been in town, it's now Lanxess. Before that, it was Chemtura, which was, again, an American chemical company. Uniroyal Chemical. It was originally the Dominion Chemical Company, I believe, way back in the 40s and 50s. So it's changed hands a lot over the last 70 years.
We know now from some consultants' reports that were done before the water crisis that they knew the natural flow of the groundwater. They knew it went southwest from the site. So it would go directly from the Uniroyal property to that E7 and E9 wells, which were the main wells. I'm sure there was at least a decade that there was some concern that the contaminants that they knew were there on the Uniroyal property, because they buried all their wastes for, decades, would be getting into the well.
People in town were drinking water which was contaminated for almost a decade, and the ministry knew about that. okay? So I think there's a reluctance from their perspective to admit that sort of thing because of liability issues. But everybody, if you talk to people who were living here at the time, the water tasted and smelled funny. That's the word that's used. It just tasted funny.
There was a chemical called NDMA, N-nitrosodimethylamine. The drinking water standard is 9 parts per trillion, and nearby wells were more than 1,000 times higher than that. NDMA is carcinogenic, it's mutagenic. It is a very nasty man-made chemical.
We also learned there were other chemicals that were noted, but of not serious concern. My response was simply, it's in the water. Any amount is of serious concern to me.
Rodney Palmer with the CBC found the world's expert on NDMA, Dr. William Leginsky from the Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland. He'd been publishing articles on NDMA for his whole career. Our environment group brought him up for 3 days of testimony at the Environmental Tribunal to testify to the toxicity of NDMA. He had never seen NDMA at such high levels in drinking water, ever, anywhere in his career.
NDMA didn't have a standard, a drinking water standard. So that's what we were told, and that we were told NDMA was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It was in all sorts of different products. So, you know, we shouldn't be so stressed out. Well, then the question of common sense became, well, then how did you know to shut the wells down?
And so there are giant, really quite substantial lagoons. They recognized just how toxic this material was because they actually had to pump this material from the plant, which is mostly on the west side, across the creek and into these ponds. And what did they use? They didn't use metal pipes, they used wooden pipes because the corrosiveness of the material would have destroyed the pipes within a matter of days. So they used wood, and they kept, rebuilding these wooden pipes to lead into these ponds.
In the 60s, they had 175,000 gallons of wastewater per day. 175,000 gallons per day from here pumped over here. Well, the ground will not absorb that much per day. That, when you multiply that by 5.5-day work week, that's close to 1 million gallons a week. In the specific case here in Elmira, there was 2 chemicals, 2,4-D, 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, and 2,4,5-T, 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid. Those chemicals were combined to make a super strong herbicide to kill grasses and weeds. The company here in town were contracted by the US military to provide what they called Agent Orange during Vietnam to spray on the jungles, not just the jungles to destroy the leaf cover and expose enemy troop movements, but they actually sprayed Agent Orange, to my knowledge, on crops and fields to also destroy the food supply for the alleged enemy of the time.
I remember someone telling me, oh yeah, Agent Orange was made here. And I'm like, what? So my first response was, oh my God, I felt shame. I felt, as a Canadian, how is it possible that people in my community were creating something that had such a deadly impact on other parts of the world?
Agent Orange was produced in this plant in the early 1960s and continued until, I believe, the early 1970s. Most of it was shipped to the United States. Ultimately, I think a lot of it ended up in Vietnam, as we know. Some residuals remained in Canadian hands, and we're finding now that some of it ended up in Canadian Forces Base Gagetown in New Brunswick. But the Canadian government actually technically refuses to acknowledge that it was produced here. So official sites deny that, in fact, Agent Orange was ever produced in Canada by Canadian companies. All right, interesting point.
In 1967, I taught at WLU for 2 years, and during that period, there was a demonstration that was held at the Uniroyal plant about Agent Orange, but it was a politically motivated kind of thing. Like many people, I simply forgot about this connection to Agent Orange and the Uniroyal plant. So that when 1989 came along, this was like a big surprise to me. And it was only, then you realize, oh yeah, that was something that had been going on for a long period of time.
When we first, as part of the Uniroyal Public Advisory Committee, were first advised about dioxins on the site, and that was about 1994. And we were shocked. I mean, we'd heard of dioxins, we'd heard of Agent Orange, but I and other citizens had been on the committee for a couple of years, from 92 till 94, and we were shocked. Dioxin is nasty, it's awful, and it's insidious, and it can go from generation to generation, and it can exist in the environment literally decades, possibly centuries, depending.
The wastes from 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T, which are the combination that create Agent Orange, the wastes produce dioxins. All those wastes had been buried on the Uniroyal site or had been slopped into lagoons or ponds that were open and overflowed and went into the creek. DDT was also produced at Uniroyal, and it's similar to dioxins in the sense that it's highly toxic to both people and wildlife. It bioaccumulates, goes up the food chain, so the DDTs and dioxins that they find in top-level mammals in the Arctic, where there are not sources of those things, can come from the Kanakajig Creek. And the dioxins and the DDTs in the creek ultimately end up in the Grand River, which is 30% of our drinking water source in Kitchener-Waterloo, and in some communities downstream on the way to Lake Erie is the whole water source.
The DDT that they are still finding in the creek, it breaks down faster than dioxins. It breaks down into DDD and DDE. But the astounding thing is, they're still finding DDT that hasn't broken down again, and they haven't produced DDT since, I think, 72 is when it was banned. The problem with dioxins, they don't break down. They are a persistent organic pollutant, POP for short. They bioaccumulate. And there are apparently dozens of different kinds of dioxins, but the absolute worst is the one that we have here locally, in the creek, in the air, in the water, and that is the 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin. That is the worst of the worst, and that's what we've got. At one point, the Kanakajig Creek was devoid of life. In the 50s and 60s, the creek was dead. Now, it is better now. However, the fish are full of dioxins and DDT above what they call tissue residue guidelines. Back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the creek was when it was devoid of life, people were not going into the creek. It would run in different colors in those days. The problem is now the creek has cleaned up, but now the creek doesn't look that bad. It doesn't smell bad. And it's actually maybe more dangerous because people think it's safe.
Another crucial point here that should be emphasized here is just how close the residences are to the chemical plant. The plant from where I'm standing here is it's about 100 meters, 120 meters away. You have a house to my left and also to my right, which are just a little bit closer than that. Every now and then there is a discharge of air pollution, odors. And 10 years ago, there was something a little bit more serious than that. There was what we in town called black rain. So it was something called the substance BLE, which I don't know what the technical terms for, but there was an explosion in one of the boilers and it released a plume of this BLE, which we refer to as black rain, and it covered a large section of town. And of course it came with a lot of odor, and that's disconcerting for most people because it's visible. You know, the thing about contaminated groundwater, you never see it. There is a siren that goes off on Saturday mornings at 12 o'clock, and it's from 2 sites, and it just tells people, you know, if it rings, there's danger. And we're one of the few towns that has this. So should there be a ring of that siren, not at 12 o'clock on a Saturday, you better take heed. There's something going on.
The province mandates a worst possible scenario, that chemical plants have to publicize the worst possible scenario. They told us that the kill zone, if there's a major rupture, the kill zone is about the first 700 meters, which is all that residential area. And after the 700 meters, then it's merely hospitalization and health effects. But there's an actual kill zone.
The fact is that occasionally something does go wrong in this plant. And when it does, alarms do go off and questions are raised. But after a certain amount of time, it quietens down again. But it's out of sight, out of mind.
Our idealism about our community and the government agencies that we thought we had invested in to protect us, very disillusioning to find out they really didn't know the answers, but what they did seem to know didn't make sense. So the citizen's voice became critical in offering common sense, in asking pointed questions.
At the scene of a car accident, the first priority is to treat the injured, not to establish blame and liability. We appeal to all parties involved to please treat Elmira's environmental injuries now.
Our little group assumed, oh boy, these are bad because they don't break down and they bioaccumulate, and there are kids playing in that creek and there are cattle drinking from the creek and so on, that there would be precipitous action taken to get rid of those or to limit them. It's now 30 years later, and again, we're hoping that some action will be taken with a bit of a new initiative. But so far, nothing has been done to remove the downstream toxins that are there.
The story that they have sold, the company and the ministry have sold, is we're going to clean up the Elmira aquifers in 30 years. Now they admit they can't do that. And they've said, we will be pumping groundwater in perpetuity. This site will be pumped and treated forever. And that is ridiculous. Because what's going to happen, the company are going to eventually cut and run. When they said that they were going to take 30 years to clean the groundwater, I knew right then. I just did the math in my head. In 2028, I will be 79 years old. I figured the whole idea of 30 years is to have most of the activists die off. This has been the goal, I believe, of the company from the get-go. Drag it out, delay, delay, delay. And they are succeeding. They're running out the clock. And the government is allowing them to do that. We have seen the company appeal to the courts. We've seen them appeal to the Environmental Appeal Board, the Environmental Review Tribunal. The company are happy to go to court and fight. It's cheaper for them to hire lawyers than it is to actually clean up this mess.
The health issues that are surfacing in Vietnam trouble me greatly. It's compounded by the health issues that are in the vets who return back to the US. That troubles me greatly, particularly because those people who were involved with the manufacturing, where is their integrity? The claim is that we did what the governments required of us at the time. That's fine, that explains your behavior in the 1960s, although I still question that. But where's your integrity now? Now that science has become more specific, now that science is telling us, health sciences, applied sciences are telling us of these consequences. Now is the time to step forward with a sense of integrity and a sense of responsibility. That doesn't mean that you're going to be 100% responsible financially or fiscally, but you do have a role in that. But surely we can come together as citizens of communities, a global village, and say, we got to fix the problem. At the scene of an accident, the first priority is to treat the injured, then to establish blame and responsibility and accountability. So my question now is, where is that integrity? And I'm finding it lacking. I'm finding that the pursuit of the economic agenda dominates. I'm finding that I don't want to be labeled as the bad guy. I'm finding that still is operative in politics, in industry, and that troubles me.
I find it increasingly concerning that now when I sit at the table with the company at that, in those round tables, which we still have, there's one person at the company that remembers the water crisis in those early days. There's no one at the ministry, at least none of the people we deal with. And there's just me with a sort of historical memory from those early days. And that is, that's a terrible responsibility.
My sense of it today, in looking at the history of Elmira and looking at the problems that have resulted from one chemical such as Agent Orange, is people are starting to wake up. People are starting to say, the costs are too high.
I think the citizens who have been active in Elmira over the last 28 years roughly, they'd like to see the site cleaned up. Actual source removal.
Local people and local governments can do a lot, and that's where the action is going to be. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be a brilliant, you don't have to be out there protesting every 5 minutes. You just have to be persistent and keep asking the questions and making sure that somehow the world knows that that's going on.
So we're actually on speaking engagements about Uniroyal and about this site at public schools. And the reception is among the kids is great. And when you're talking grade 6s and 7s and 8s, they've never heard of Elmira. They have no inkling that the town lost their water and is now on a pipeline.
The shift that I see that needs to happen is the acceptance of cradle-to-grave responsibility for products and services that we produce in our communities. I don't care whether it's in a North American community and culture, anywhere in the world, is that those producers need to have it ingrained in them. They are responsible from the birth of their product and service until the death of that service and product. Only then can we begin to protect the future for our generations to come, to leave a legacy of care, to leave a legacy of nurturance, to leave a legacy of health and therefore survival. And that acceptance means, in my mind, that we have to set aside the predominance of the economic agenda and to ask, how does this serve the community best? You bet there's going to be lots of debate about that, but that debate needs to take place, and that debate can't take place if people are filtering the news, if they're filtering the information, if they're censoring what's going on. And we need to relax that agenda in acceptance of the privilege of being on Earth, and that we make our steps light so that it can be preserved for generations to come who will also have a fair chance to take a step on the Earth.